Good morning, students. Today we are going to get into the actual elements of art, which is what we have in Chapter 2. And as you'll recall, saying the visual elements of art is another way of saying the language of art. So we're going to get into all of that today. Some of this may seem like things that you would have learned in kindergarten or first grade, but we're going to go into it more deeply than that, and we're going to look at different examples of how different artists handle the different elements of art. So we have a quote to open the chapter from artist Georgia O'Keeffe. She was a painter. She died, I want to say, late 20th century. I don't quite remember, but she was a very brilliant painter, and she says, "I found I could say things with color and shapes that I couldn't say in any other way, things I had no words for." So that's one of the things that artists use art for, is they express those things they cannot say verbally. So here we go into the actual visual elements of art, and I'm going to break them down one at a time, but here they all are all at once. So they are color, shape, line, light, value, texture, space, time, motion. And with the language of art, we are able to communicate thoughts and feelings about our visual and tactile experiences in our world. And one of the things to keep in mind is these are often also terms that are used in a type of art criticism known as formalism, where we are purely talking about the form of the art. That is exactly what we see when we look at a work of art. So the visual elements of art are sometimes known as the plastic elements of art. That's actually kind of an old-fashioned term, but you do hear that every once in a while. So an artist will select a medium, and by medium I mean they will decide if they're drawing, and if they're drawing in pencil or charcoal or pastel. They might be painting, they might be doing an oil painting or a watercolor painting or an acrylic painting. They might be doing sculpture, which they might, carve out of a rock or mold with clay, architecture, photography, textiles, ceramics, and so forth. And then they will use the visual elements to express themselves in whatever medium it is that they've chosen. And then the principles of design we're going to get into in Chapter 3, and essentially principles of design have to do with how artists apply the actual elements of art, and they include unity, balance, rhythm, scale, proportion, and some other things. So we're going to start with the very simplest and also the most complex of the elements of art, and that is line. And line serves as the basic building block for all art. It has the capacity to evoke thoughts and emotions in the way that the artist puts that line down. It can have expressive qualities, and we'll also get into that a little bit more. So here we have a basic dictionary textbook of line, both from mathematics and from an artistic perspective. So in geometry, a line is made up of an infinite number of points, and the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. And in art, a line is a moving dot. So think of it this way. When the artist takes their pencil or their paintbrush and they put it down to their paper or canvas, that very first mark is the dot, and then when they begin to move their paintbrush or their pencil, that is the moving dot. So as I said, line can have expressive qualities. It has measure, which is length and width are the things that can give it expressive qualities. Also in the way that you look at is if it is it a line that is completely straight, is it a line that has some curve to it, that sort of thing. So we're going to look at some works of art now, or in a moment, in the next 2 slides. So line may be perceived as delicate, tentative, elegant, assertive, forceful, or even brutal. And as I said, in the next 2 slides, we're going to look at the qualities of line and see how the artists handled them. And these are both 2 very abstract works, and they're really, we are looking at them from their purely formal qualities here in some regards. So the first one is by the artist Jackson Pollock. And you can see I lost my mouse. That's okay. So the first one we're looking at is Jackson Pollock. And here we have number 14, Gray from 1948. This is enamel and gesso on paper. And one of the things about Jackson Pollock, we'll be talking about him a lot this semester because he was a very important 20th century artist. And one of the things he's famous for are his drip or splatter paintings, where basically he would stand over a canvas or a piece of paper and let his brush just sort of drip the paint wherever it would go. So when you look at this, you can see that there's lots of lines. They are very curvy. Some of them are very thin. Some of them are very thick. And then when we look at the next one by Saul Levitt, this is his lines from four corners to points on a grid. And in this piece, the artist has charted out ahead of time, very mathematically, all of the lines in his piece. And this is just a detail of the whole thing. This actually kind of encompasses a whole room. And he designed it in such a way that all of the lines are supposed to be of exactly the same length, in which when you look at this detail, it's kind of hard to see. But you can also see that they are all about the same width at the very least. So when you look at this versus this, think to yourself, what looks more expressive? Is this more expressive, or is this? So lines, as I said, can have all kinds of qualities. They can be straight, they can be curved, they can be vertical, horizontal, diagonal, and zigzagged. And there's also different types of lines that we're going to look at. Contour lines are lines that are created by the edges of things, and we'll see that in one of the slides. Actual lines are like the lines we saw in the Jackson Pollock piece and the Saul Levitt piece. They are connected and continuous. Implied lines are lines that may not be connected. They're lines that your eye kind of takes over and completes. And we'll look at an example of those. And then psychological lines are lines that are created by a mental or perceptual connection. For example, when a character or a figure points at or looks at another person in the picture. And sometimes there might actually be a literal line in the piece that you can see. There might also be things like the arrangement of furniture in a piece. Anyway, we'll talk about that as we go. So here we have Edward Weston's Knees from 1927, and I'm going to take my cursor here, the arrow, and the lines that are formed by the edges of things are contour lines. So if you look, the outside of the knees themselves, and also from the contrast of the calf folding into the thigh, also creates a really nice contour line. And then here we have an example of actual and implied lines. So in letter A, it's connected and continuous. It is an actual line. And then in B and C, we have two implied lines, one that is formed by dots or slashes. I think they look more like slashes in letter B. And then in letter C, the other line is formed by psychologically connecting the edges of series of straight lines, kind of like, the old AT&T logo. So a little bit more about line. Edges can be perceived because the objects differ from the background in value, texture, or color. So let's go back again to the knees. Right in the that crook where the calf and the thigh meet, there's a very deep shadow that creates a line. It looks different. The value is different. We're going to get into value also in this chapter. And then shading can create or models roundness. And one of the hallmarks of Renaissance painting is the use of implied lines to create or echo the structures of the composition. So here we're going to look at a different way of using an implied line, and here it really is all about how the artist creates the composition. So this is Leonardo da Vinci's The Madonna of the Rocks. If you saw the Da Vinci Code, you saw this in that film. And Da Vinci, a lot of things in the Da Vinci Code are incorrect. But one of the things that they are correct is he liked to use this triangle or pyramid shape quite a lot to create his compositions. And you can see from the top of the head of the Virgin Mary going, you could draw a line there going down from her head along her arm to the baby Jesus. And then on this side, we have a line that could be drawn on down her other line down to John the Baptist, baby John the Baptist. So just again, another way of drawing lines. And there's all kinds of symbolism in there as well, where the baby John the Baptist, both Jesus and John the Baptist were crucified at the end of their lives. So this is like a foreshadowing and kind of an awareness of what will happen in the future, even though they are little babies. All right, so sometimes the quality of line can be psychological. So I want you to look at this piece here. It's by Emily Mary Osborne. It is called Nameless and Friendless, from about 1834. It's painted in oil on canvas. And look at the characters in this piece, and I'll tell you a little bit about who they are. So first of all, the important thing to note is that the painter of this piece is a woman, and this was painted in the 19th century. So think about the kinds of roles that women might have had available to them for employment and so forth in the Victorian era. And so you see there's a woman there with her son. He's clutching what we assume is her portfolio. And there's an art dealer sitting behind a desk looking at her work of art with a critical kind of looking eye. And there's a guy hanging pictures on the wall, kind of looking down, and a guy looking up from his newspaper. But do you see a line in the painting? And do you know why it's there? So, okay, this might be hard, so I'm going to point it out to you. So here is my arrow once again. This line separates the woman from the art dealer. And why does it do so? Well, because several reasons. First of all, she's a woman and she is dressed in black. And in that period of time, if a woman was a widow, she would be wearing black for quite a long time after her husband died. So she's probably alone in the world with her son, and she needs to make some money. And nameless and friendless refers to the position of women artists pretty much at that point in time, unless you had someone really supporting you. The guy looking over his paper at her also has a guy next to him who's kind of looking at her very suspiciously, regarding her as some kind of oddity. So it was a tough thing. So there's a psychological line drawn between the woman and the art dealer, the woman and the art world, yeah, not a great place to be. So we're going to talk a little bit about the functions of line. As we've seen, line outlines and creates shape. Line can also create depth and texture, and line can suggest direction and movement. So let's look at some things. So here we have line outlining and giving actual shape. And this is a photograph, and we're not really used to seeing a lot of lines in photographs, but here, the artists who created this piece have very cleverly, I assume, attached some kind of wires to this woman's braids to form the lines of her hair and also the lines going around the baby Jesus. And so this is kind of a Madonna and Child, kind of hearkening back to the types of works that Da Vinci was doing of the Madonna and Child, but in a very modern kind of way. And then lines also can create depth and texture. So this is by Elizabeth Catlett. This is called Sharecropper from 1968. Elizabeth Catlett did a lot of works that were prints. This is a print. And in this particular type of print, it's hard to do shading in any kind of subtle way. So you need to use line to create any depth or texture that you want. So you can see it in the texture of the sharecropper's hair. You can see it in the texture of the hat. They also, in the background, creates a sense of depth. And then lines also suggest direction and movement. So if you remember back to the very first chapter where we had that crazy performance artist, Orlan, who was trying to look like Venus. This is the Venus she was trying to look at. This is the full painting. This is by Sandro Botticelli. It's called The Birth of Venus, and it is oil on canvas, and I can't believe I'm getting pop-ups. Okay, there we go. Whoops. Let's go back. Sorry about that, gang. Okay, there we go. So line is to suggest direction and movement. And what is going on here, if you don't know the story of Venus, it's kind of a weird one. The Romans and the Greeks had a lot of interesting origin stories for their gods and goddesses, in the way that today we have origin stories for our superheroes. So Venus was born when her father was... Kronos was Venus's father. He was the god of kind of everything, but he was a cruel god, and he was killed by his children, who cut him apart, and they threw his genitals into the Mother Ocean, and then the Mother Ocean gave birth to another goddess. Here she is, Venus, and because she's a goddess, she is born fully adult. And it said that she came up out of the waves fully grown and naked on a half shell, or a clamshell, as you can see here where my arrow is. So then, as she's coming to shore, these other characters, these guys over here, these are the winds. They are blowing her to shore. You can see the air supposed to be coming out of their mouths. And then over here is another nymph or goddess named Pomona, and she is going to cover Venus's nudity with this cape. So take a look at this for a moment. This is a huge piece. It's over 5 feet by 9 feet. So it would have been massive. But take a look at it and try to figure out where the lines that are suggesting movement are. So, okay, if you said that the lines are in the shape of the billowing fabric on the winds here, you'd be correct. Also in the movement of her hair, and also in the billows of the fabric that Pomona is about to throw upon Venus as well. All of those things suggest movement. You could even say the little waves down here also, because she's being moved to the shore there. And then here, this is a very different painting, a different kind of painting, very different kind of style by Jacob Lawrence. This is from his Harriet Tubman series. He is showing young slave children at play, and very different type of medium too. He's using something called casein on gessoed hardboard, so it gives a very different feeling from the oil on canvas. And when you look at this, are the lines vertical, horizontal, or diagonal? And I think you can easily say that they are diagonal. And then there are some horizontal lines too. So, well, let's have a look at what all that means. So lines imply different things. So horizontal lines can suggest stability, and vertical lines can defy gravity and suggest assertiveness. And then diagonal lines can imply movement and directionality. So there you saw that. And then there are lots of different ways to create texture with line as well. One is modeling, and that is the creation of the illusion of roundness or 3 dimensions through the use of light and shadow. You can do that very easily with pencil or charcoal. Also stippling, the use of a pattern of dots that thickens and thins. Hatching is using a series of closely spaced parallel lines to achieve shading. And then cross-hatching is a series of lines that run in a different direction and cross each other. So here we have, under letter A, we have stippling, and you can see the closer the dots are to each other, the darker it appears. And in letter B, we have hatching, and again, the closer the lines are to one another, the darker it appears. And then you can see cross-hatching in C and contour hatching in D. So now let's talk about shape, volume, and mass. Again, shapes, stuff that we learned in elementary school, but we're going to go into it a little bit more. So shape has many definitions. In art, shapes are defined as the areas within a composition that have boundaries separating them from what surrounds them. Shapes make those areas distinct. And shape can also be communicated through patches of color and texture. So here is a piece by Piet Mondrian, and he was known for creating these compositions that are very geometrical. Lots of squares and rectangles, also primary colors, which we'll be talking about shortly. And what we're actually going to do, Piet Mondrian, his pieces look very, very simple, but it's kind of deceptive. He actually inspired other kinds of artists to do similar works, and we're going to look at some of those in our discussion of shape, mass, and volume. So here we have two-dimensional painting. And then the word form is often used to speak about shapes in sculpture and architecture, three-dimensional works of art. So here we have a sculpture by Helene Brandt, and it is influenced by Mondrian, and she's in fact given it the title Mondrian Variations, Construction Number 3B, with 4 red squares and 2 planes. So here we have a form rather than just a flat shape coming out from the wall, and it's doing all kinds of things like casting shadows back on the wall. So it's kind of interesting in that regard. And then here we have a work of architecture that was influenced by the Mondrian paintings. This is Schroeder House. The architect was Gerrit Rietveld. And you can see, again here there's lines and squares and rectangles. So volume refers to the mass or the bulk of a 3D work. It is the amount of space it contains. So you could say a work of architecture would have a lot of volume. And then mass. This is not influenced by Piet Mondrian. We're getting away from that. So here in three-dimensional art, the mass of an object refers to its bulk. And what you're looking at here is a Holocaust memorial in Vienna to the victims of World War II. This is by Rachel Whiteread. And basically, this is a solid structure. I'm looking at my book to remind myself of how big it is. So here we have, this is in Vienna, and it possesses the gravity of a stone pyramid and evokes the simplicity and serenity of a mausoleum. It's built of concrete. It weighs 250 tons, so it has a lot of mass. And the idea is it's an inverted library. The books protrude on the outside. And this is recognition of the significance of study to the Jewish people, who are sometimes known as the people of the book. And then the so-called doors to this library are actually inaccessible. So she's basically making a symbolic statement that the Holocaust rendered all of this knowledge that the Jewish people had inaccessible. And she's doing it symbolically with a massive work. So works of art can also have actual mass and implied mass, just like we have actual line and implied line. Actual mass occupies three-dimensional space and has measurable volume and weight. Implied mass creates the illusion of possessing volume, having weight, and occupying three-dimensional space. So let's see how that works out. So here is a painting by Mark Tansey. It's called Landscape from 1994. It's two-dimensional. It's oil on canvas. So if you look at this, I have the question, is the mass here actual or implied? Well, it's a painting, it's implied. But if you look at the way he's handled the values, he's gradually shaping the pieces from dark to light. So it feels as though you've got kind of the remainders of civilization all sort of tumbled together. Things like the Great Sphinx, and I think the Statue of Liberty might be in there somewhere, and George Washington's face from Mount Rushmore, and on the far right we have Constantine's head next to a pharaoh's head. So all of these trappings of great civilizations all sort of falling together like the end of everything. So he's using mass to show the great weight of that loss, or saying this is, what our future could be if we're not careful. All right, so now we're going to look more into the types of shapes. Again, seems elementary, but stick with me. So geometric shapes are regular and precise. So for example, rectangles and circles. They can be straight, which is rectilinear, or curved, which is curvilinear. And then organic shapes are completely different. They can appear in nature. You don't see triangles and rectangles in nature, but you see biomorphic shapes or amorphous shapes in nature. So geometric shapes are like this sculpture here by David Smith. This is actually not in your book. It was in an older version of the book, and I like this better than what your book has. This is David Smith's Cubi 18, and it is polished stainless steel squares and rectangles. So there they are. And then here's something very unusual where an architect will try to push past the bounds of what we think of as ordinary buildings and do something quite different. So this is Frank Gehry's Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, Spain. And here he's creating a more organic feeling building by making the shapes curvilinear. So now we're going to compare and contrast some lines and shapes and some color too. We have Picasso and Colescott. These are two artists. As I said in Chapter 1, we're going to be doing this throughout the semester, looking at different works of art that might be similar. And before I show you the works of art, what I will tell you about Colescott, his name is Robert Colescott, and one of the things that he likes to do is to take famous works of art from art history and give them a different perspective, specifically an African American perspective. And he also likes to make things funny, so sometimes his stuff has a very comic feel. So the first work we're going to look at is by Pablo Picasso. This is Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, and he painted this in 1907. If you've taken my African art class, you know that this painting was done after Picasso visited the African art exhibition at the World's Fair in Paris, and that he was greatly influenced by it, and we have African art to really thank, unacknowledged by Picasso until many years later, for the modernist movement. But for now, take a look at this, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, basically the women of Avignon, and notice the kinds of shapes, the kinds of colors. And then let's look at Les Demoiselles d'Alabama by Robert Colescott. So there's some major differences here. This was painted in 1985, so there's one major difference right there. But hopefully you can look at these, and there's a couple of things that Colescott has done to kind of create a very different feeling. So which one feels more colorful and more lively? I think that's easy to answer. That would be the Colescott. And then which one has rectilinear lines? That would be Picasso. More curvilinear lines here. And then maybe even most importantly, beyond color, beyond shape, beyond line, what has Colescott done with the women in his painting as opposed to what Picasso did with his? If you answered that he's clothed them, that is what I'm looking for. Basically, Colescott has humanized these women. He's given them each distinct personalities. They feel like people that you might actually know, whereas these women feel very anonymous. So I think that he's giving them back their dignity and their humanity by giving them clothing. So let's move on to biomorphic shapes, which are said to have a form like a biological entity, and we get that word from the Greek word morph. So this is Elizabeth Marie's Tangled, and what's interesting about this is an oil painting that is not on a rectangular piece of canvas or a square piece of canvas like we are accustomed to seeing. Instead, she shaped this canvas out of wood. She even in the center, there's an opening that she created, so it's very biomorphic. It almost feels like something you might see under a test tube or something like that. And then shapes need not be clearly defined or derived from nature or even the laws of geometry. A lot of artists, such as Helen Frankenthaler here, create amorphous shapes, which are shapes that just kind of go all over the place. And what Helen Frankenthaler did here is she created her painting, and the way she tends to create her paintings is she'll take an unprimed bit of canvas and pour the paint on it and let it go where it will go and let it blend together and do what it will do. So it's a very sort of instinctive approach to creating art. So then we also have positive and negative shapes. And positive shapes are the objects or figures that the viewer focuses on. And negative shapes are the empty space or the space filled with other imagery that are left over in the piece. So let's look at some of those. So when you look at this, what do you think is meant to be the foreground and the background? What do you think is the positive shape? Is it what big muscles you have? Or is it all those little words in the background? Positive would definitely be what big muscles you have, because it's the thing that really stands out. And this is another word work by Barbara Kruger, who we've looked at before. And she's kind of, making fun of men and relationships. All right, so along with positive and negative space, we also get a figure ground terminology. As I said here, I asked, what's the foreground? What's the background? That also goes with the figure ground relationship. It's the relationship between the positive and negative shapes in a piece. And we get figure ground reversals when the positive and negative shapes in a piece can be reversed or ambiguous. So, that is something that artists use sometimes for psychological effect. We tend to perceive things in context, and context has a lot to do with what we decide is in the foreground and what is in the background. So here is this, you might have seen this is kind of a psychological thing. They often show this in psychology class, which shapes are positive and which shapes are negative. Do you see a vase in this picture? Or do you see two faces facing one another? That is the question. So this is where they're playing, this is where it's ambiguous. They're playing with the background and the foreground. And then some artists purposely make things very ambiguous to kind of throw you off. This is called Spring by Jasper Johns. And here in Spring, I'm looking to see what it says in your book. He's showing actually in the background, oh phooey, my version of it doesn't have Rubin vases. So that has nothing to do with this thing. All right, we're going to skip, never mind. This is a better piece anyway. This is Edward Steichen's painting, or actually photograph, of the sculptor Rodin. And some of you might have been to the Rodin Museum in Philadelphia. And one of his most famous sculptures is The Thinker. So we see that sculpture on the right. And then in the background, rising sort of, well, amorphously, is an image of the writer Victor Hugo, which was a sketch that he was working on at the time for what was going to be a sculpture of Victor Hugo. And then you see the silhouette of the artist Rodin himself kind of in the foreground there. But because of the way the artist, the photographer, is playing with the light and the black and the white and the contrast, you could really try to decide, well, what's in the background, what's in the foreground. And then shape as icon is very important. Some shapes carry immediate associations with them. So for example, if you were to see the Christian cross or the Star of David or the yin and yang symbol, it immediately brings things to mind for you. Shape is a powerful visual element, and the representation of shape is a powerful design tool. So for example, Hitler's swastika, immediately when you see that, you think of things. You can't help it. And then on the right is a Sanskrit swastika. So what's the difference? Let me tell you. Thousands and thousands of years ago, Sanskrit people in India used the swastika as a symbol of the sun. And in fact, it's a really ancient symbol that's used by a lot of indigenous peoples, including Native Americans. And the thing about, Hitler and World War II is nobody wants to use this symbol anymore, even though at one time it had very positive associations. I'm trying to find my cough drops that I got out for myself somewhere. All right. Oh, there they are. Okay. So anyway, at one time it had very positive associations, and now nobody wants to use it because Hitler used it, and it people see it, and that's immediately what their mind goes to. It no longer can conjure up something positive for people. So that's where we see, oh yeah, shape is extremely important. So here we have a poster. This is actually kind of a political poster of Che Guevara. He was a social activist and a revolutionary. And so he himself has become an icon associated with class struggle, guerrilla warfare, and counterculture. And so a lot of young people will wear t-shirts with his face on them. They might not even know what in the heck it means. It's just something cool to wear, but it's really, about revolution, and they're not wearing it because they're familiar with who he was. He was actually originally an Argentinian physicist who became a Marxist revolutionary, and he joined Fidel Castro's efforts to depose the U.S.-backed dictator Batista. And he was from Cuba, and then he went on to incite or inspire, depending on who you're talking to, revolutions in both Africa and Latin America. And ultimately, he was captured and executed, but he has come to symbolize struggle for a lot of people. And so when you see his face, that's what that's all about. So this is another shape, a little bit outdated now, but these are the shapes that Apple used when they were first putting out the iPod, and to show shapes of people dancing and so forth, and kind of the idea of individuality, and you could be in your own world and that sort of thing. It was instantly recognizable. So now we're going to look at light and value. So visible light is the part of the spectrum of electromagnetic energy that we can see. And without light, there is no art. We can't make art without light. And then value, when we talk about value in art, we're talking about the value of a color of a surface as its lightness or darkness. You've heard me say it already a couple of times in this slideshow. And then value contrast, the degrees of difference between shades of gray. And when we draw objects or figures with a high value contrast, it makes them easy to see. And value pattern describes the variation in light and dark within a composition. So let's use this as an example. This is an example of value contrast. We have letter A, letter B, letter C. Which one of these is the easiest to read? If you said B or C, you'd be correct. And the reason for that is there's a very high contrast between black and white. So it's much easier to see than letter A, where everything is in different shades of gray. And then some painters like to work what we call monochromatically, or in one color. So this is a piece called Number 2 by Feng Lijun. I'm probably mispronouncing that. It kind of feels like a photograph of guys goofing around on the beach. But he actually painted this in a value scale of gray that contains 7 shades of gray, varying between a gray that is almost black to the left, and then one that is slightly off-white to the right. So he's using a very high value contrast there. And you have this a little bit here, this next word, chiaroscuro, or chiaroscuro, correctly. It's an Italian word, and what it refers to is the gradual shifting from light to dark through a successive gradation of tones across a curved surface. And this term came about in Renaissance Italy, when artists were very interested in trying to create a three-dimensional illusion on canvas. So when you've got a picture with chiaroscuro, chiaro means light, scuro means dark. So right there, literally light to dark. By using a very subtle succession of grading your tones, you can create the illusion of 3 dimensions. So this is a drawing in this particular case. This is from 1801, Pierre-Paul Prud'hon, La Source. And it's a very beautiful drawing, very sensitive. He's drawn it on gray paper. And then he's taken black chalk and white chalk, and he's used the black chalk to create, some very dark areas. And then on other places that are curved, he's used very dark chalk to create those shadows, and then used white chalk to bring out areas that are lighter, and still leaving the gray of the paper as kind of a medium tone. But it does give you a really wonderful, nearly three-dimensional effect. And then Pablo Picasso, here he is before he discovered African art. And, this is proof that Picasso went through, very classical training, as really all great artists do, no matter if they wind up working abstractly like Jackson Pollock did. They all at one time started out doing work like this. And this is Pablo Picasso's self-portrait of 1900. It's charcoal on paper, and he too is using chiaroscuro to, hollow out his cheeks there, and to show, what his lips are shaped like, and to show his nose. So similar sort of thing, a little bit rougher than the Pierre-Paul Prud'homme piece, but you get the idea. And then we also have descriptive and expressive properties of values. So again, values kind of refers to the different blacks, grays, and whites, might be used to describe objects, or possibly to evoke emotional response in the viewer. So we're going to look at something that's a little bit more complex. Actually, I'm going to skip this. This is something your book uses. It doesn't really do a lot for me, except on the left-hand side, you can see the value. There's a lot of value contrast, whereas on the right side, there's not a lot. Okay. And then this is a photograph, a black and white photograph by Lorraine O'Grady. And that is actually Lorraine O'Grady herself in the photograph. This is from a performance art piece she did called Mademoiselle Bourgeoise Noire Goes to the New Museum. And what she is doing in this piece is she's actually protesting. It's called Miss Middle Class Black, and she appeared in an evening gown that she made, constructed completely of 180 pairs of white gloves, and she's shouting out poems, so that's why her mouth is open, against the racial politics of the art establishment. So the white gloves are evocative of both race and class. And, they also show up against her her very dark skin and her mouth open and everything. Definitely gives you a very expressive feeling there. And then finally, color. So language connects emotion with color, and color can trigger emotional responses in the observer. So, different colors, people like to paint their rooms certain colors because they want to evoke certain moods with those colors. So let's talk a little bit more about that. And we're going to start with a compare and contrast. These are two paintings by the artist Mark Rothko. And I want you to notice each of the paintings on the left. That one was done in 1949. The other one was done many years later in 1970. So, does color convey emotional content here for you? What do you think it is? So look at it for a few moments. I'm going to look at my notes for just a moment. So, one of the things that might give you a clue, in the one on the right, it was painted shortly before his death in 1970. He committed suicide. So what do you think possibly he might have been going through? Was he depressed when he painted Black on Gray? Was he perhaps in a better frame of mind when he painted number 22 in 1949? If you look on the left, then 1949, when most of his works are, this is what he's famous for, doing these sort of very, very brilliant splotches of color in rectangles on canvas. And they kind of look like a window. And one of the things that we talked about when I was an undergraduate is as he got closer and closer to the end of his life, that window closed more and more. So kind of depressing. But also, if we're looking at art from a psychological viewpoint, it tells us a lot. All right, so some more psychological dimensions of color and some vocab. So hue, value, and saturation. So hue is a term for the family of color. For example, the blue hues, all the different blues, blue-violet, blue-green that you might see, cerulean blue, ultramarine blue. For those of you that paint, you know these colors. And then colors also can have temperature. Cool colors are the colors on the green-blue side of the color wheel. Warm colors are on the yellow, orange, red side of the color wheel. Saturation refers to the pureness of the color. In other words, it has not had other things added to it, as in shades or tints. So with shades, you're adding black to a hue, and with a tint, you're adding white to a hue. So if we look at the picture on the left, which I think is by Aaron Douglas, I'm not quite sure, but I believe it is. Look at that one, and then look at the Miriam Schapiro piece on the right. Which one is made of cool colors and which one is made of warm colors? And if you paid attention to the last slide, you would say, well, the one on the left is the cool colors. That's made up of lots of blues, some violets, and so forth. Aside from the brown, it's a very cool painting. And on the right, of course, it's warm colors. It predominantly is red. Warm colors, yeah. And then sometimes artists actually will use complementary colors, colors that sit across from each other on the color wheel to make objects pop out in their work. So this is Sandro Chia's Incident at the Tintoretto Cafe. And Sandro is using the bright orange against the blues and violets of the background to kind of make things pop out. All right, some more vocab. Additive and subtractive colors. So additive color is something that we see in theater. So those of you who are theater majors or have worked in theater might be familiar with the idea of using lights on the stage to mix light, and they create kind of a different effect. And then subtractive color is when you're mixing pigments, as in paint. Primary colors are colors that cannot be derived from the mixing of other colors, and hopefully you all know that the primary colors are red, yellow, and blue, and then secondary colors are created from the overlap or the mixing of two primary colors. So with secondary colors you get orange, green, and violet. So on the left, you can see an additive color mixture that you might do. This is something that a theater tech would use to figure out what kind of lighting to do on the stage. And you can see for them, mixing colors with light, using colored lights, looks a bit differently than what it looks like on the right, the subtractive color mixture. And that's mostly what we're going to be sticking with in this chapter, is talking about subtractive color mixes. So complementary versus analogous colors, some more stuff. So in pigments, as I said, the primary colors are red, yellow, and blue. They cannot be produced from mixing other colors. Tertiary colors are created by mixing pigments of primary and secondary colors. So let's say blue plus green makes blue-green. Blue plus violet makes blue-violet. And then analogous colors are hues that lie next to each other on the color wheel. And then as we saw previously, complementary colors are colors that lie across from one another on the color wheel. So here's the color wheel itself. And you can see directly across from each other we have red and green. Across from orange is blue. And then those letters tell us primary, so yellow, red, blue, primary. Secondary is green, orange, and violet. And then tertiary, red, violet, red, orange, yellow, green, and blue, violet. And did I say red, violet? Okay, there it is. Anyway, you get the idea. So local color versus optical color is also a way that artists use color and play with it when they are creating work. So local color refers to the hue of an object as created by the colors its surface reflects under normal lighting conditions. What are normal lighting conditions? Normal lighting conditions are basically outside at noon. That would be like the best way to describe that, because once you go inside, you might be under fluorescent lights or different kinds of lights, LED lights, and so forth, and that is what produces optical color. So our perceptions of color can vary with lighting conditions. And then also different times of day affect the way that things appear. So here we have, let me see, did I do that? No, I didn't. It would have been great if I had done that. Well, Google, if you like, Claude Monet haystacks, and you will see that Claude Monet painted haystacks at all different times of day and night to show the quality of color at different times of day. So this one is a haystack at sunset near Giverny, where he lived, and he painted in Giverny all the time. And you can see it has that sort of very infused orange look that you get when the sun is going down and everything's kind of orangey. And then this is an example of what you might see of optical color. This is Vincent van Gogh's The Night Cafe, and he's also using complementary colors to great effect here too. And the red on the walls and the green on the ceiling, it's kind of jarring. But what also is here, back in those days, whoops, here we go. Back in those days, they used gas lights. So gas lights produced a particular kind of feeling. And so what Van Gogh is trying to get across with this is a feeling of a bar that you might go to late at night to get wrecked in. So there you go. And then this is a piece by Audrey Flack. And she does what are called photorealist paintings. And so what that means is they're very realistic. They feel like photographs. And one of the things that's important to Audrey Flack as an artist is the ability to communicate what she wants to get across. And she feels the best way to do that is with photorealism. So this is called Marilyn Vanitas. And vanitas, it means vanity, yes, but also it was also a type of painting that was done and still is done to remind us that we're dying. We're all mortal and we're all dying, and all of these things pass. And so she's also paying tribute to Marilyn Monroe as considered to be a beautiful woman. And she's also showing objects in the piece that relate to vanity, like cosmetics and mirrors and jewelry. And again, they're also juxtaposed with things that talk about the eventuality of death, like an hourglass and a pocket watch. Here's the pocket watch. There's the hourglass. Also a candle burning. Candles go out. And so there's also what's incredible about this is it's practically an 8-foot square. It's huge, so when you see this, it kind of hits you in the face. But the artist is using, the incredible color of the fruit contrasting against the blue of the other objects. And the fruit is there to remind us the fruit doesn't last forever either, neither do the roses. So she's using color in a big way to remind us of all these things. So color also has a lot to do with symbol. We can link mood with color. Also in different, cultures, colors are assigned different meanings. For example, in the West, we tend to wear black when we go to a funeral, whereas for the Chinese, they wear white. And feelings and behavior can be symbolized with color as well. And as I said just now, the symbols and meanings of colors are culture specific. So this piece here, this is by an artist and fashion designer named Yinka Shonibare. And Yinka is from Nigeria. And this is contemporary. This is from 1999. But what he's done is he's taken Victorian clothes. And Victorian clothes would have been like early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, and he's put them in contemporary, colorful printed designs that are actually something that you would see in today's Africa. So he's sort of using it to kind of turn the idea of Victorianism and the idea of like the British who colonized Nigeria, kind of turning that whole thing on its head and making a statement about issues of African identity and African authenticity. And the symbolism of color is very important in Africa. So the next element we're going to look at is texture. And texture comes from the Latin word for weaving. If you think of a weaving, weaving has lots of texture. And texture is a word used to describe the surface character of things through the sense of touch. And an artist can emphasize or distort texture of an object to evoke an emotional response in the viewer. And then a term that we'll be using along here is the word impasto. And impasto means a thick buildup of paint on the surface of the canvas, so that in and of itself, that thick buildup has a texture. So here we have, this is by Leon Kossoff. It's a little bit different from the picture in the book, but I thought this actually is a better picture to convey what I'm talking about. This is a Portrait of Father, number 2, Oil on Board. And although this is a photograph, you can see that the paint was laid on very, very thickly. And just kind of look at this for a second, get a feeling for it. And we're going to look next at Marie Laurencens' Mother and Child from 1928, also an oil painting. What do you think about the texture here? Also the colors. Which parent do you think is better liked by their child? Father? Mother? And that's all based on the texture of the piece. So types of texture, again, we've got actual, subversive, visual. So actual texture is tactile. You can touch it. Tactile means touch. So for example, impasto, if you ran your fingers across the Kossoff painting, you would feel the texture. You'd also get, nabbed by the guards in the museum, but that's another story. Then visual texture is simulated texture. It looks like a texture, but it can't be felt. So, for example, a trompe-l'oeil painting, that's a French word and a style of painting that means to trick the eye. Trompe-l'oeil, trick the eye, and we'll look at an example. And then there's subversive texture, which is texture chosen or created by the object to subvert or undermine our ideas about the object they depict. Well, what do we mean? Well, look. All right, so here's an example of visual texture. This is also kind of falls into that idea of the Vanitas painting, also sometimes called Memento Mori. This is by Rachel Ruysch. This was a still life painted after 1700, oil on canvas. If you ran your finger across the surface of this canvas, it would be perfectly smooth. Instead, what the artist is trying to convey is the texture of flowers that are dying. And again, this is the idea of the Vanitas, of the Memento Mori. It's a reminder we are all dying. How happy. Anyway, you get the idea. This is visual texture. It is implied only. And then we go here. This is A Total Visual Joke by David Gahuli. It's a ceramic piece called A Bowl of Chocolate Mousse. He's making several jokes. Chocolate mousse, of course, is a lovely whipped dessert that's kind of sort of like pudding but lighter, and it's not an actual mousse, but here he's made an actual mousse. And of course, if you tried to bite into this, you'd be really, really disappointed. So this is an example of subversive texture. And then this is an example of trompe-l'oeil. This is another piece that we would consider to be photorealistic. This is by James Rosenquist. And James Rosenquist has a thing for painting these dolls behind sort of cellophane wrap. It's kind of creepy. But the thing about it is he's also showing his incredible skill at painting, because it feels as though you could reach out and touch that painting and you would actually feel the crinkle of the the acrylic wrapping. So that is a really good trompe-l'oeil painting. And then here's another subversive piece. We've got Merritt Oppenheim's Object from 1936. Merritt Oppenheim was one of the Surrealists. And what the Surrealists were known for, they were more painters than sculptors, but here we have something that's considered sculpture. What they like to do, surreal is a French word meaning super real. And what they like to do is take things and render them in a way that was very realistic, but put things together that don't go together. So here we have a fur-covered cup, saucer, and spoon. And when I show this most of the time, my classes kind of go, ew, because you're thinking about pouring coffee into that and then you're completely grossed out. So subversive. Okay, next element is space. We're getting there. We're almost done. So space talks about how objects exist in three-dimensional space. And as we've seen, some art is truly three-dimensional, like sculpture and architecture, and then some art is just trying to depict space on a two-dimensional surface. So we can create the illusion of depth by overlapping objects. Here we have overlapping circles and arcs. And then you can also create an illusion of depth by the principle of things that are closer to us are larger and things that are farther away are smaller. As you can see here, this is a silver dye bleach print made from a digitally assisted montage. So it's kind of like collage, but it's all the same material. And it was probably done in Photoshop. So this figure here of the woman is in the foreground. It is the biggest. And then we've got these people that are, because of their size, back here in these little trees, they're much farther away because they're small. So that's one way of conveying space. And then here we have Louis Comfort Tiffany's beautiful stained glass. We'll see a lot of Tiffany throughout the semester because he was a very talented glass artist. And here he's both overlapping and using relative size to show how things are distant or far away. Of course, the mountains are much farther away. This tree here, yeah, here, the magnolia tree is in the front. The irises go behind it, and then there's some more magnolias behind it, and then the mountains go off into the far distance. So another way that artists use space or convey space is through linear perspective. And linear perspective also uses the idea that the further objects are from us, the smaller they look, and things that are closer to us look larger, and things that are further away look smaller. And artists use different techniques like relative size and linear perspective to create the illusion of depth in a piece of art. So, a couple of vocab words in the illusion of depth, and then I'm going to show you a slide that illustrates all of these things. So, in a work of art, you will have a vanishing point if they're using linear perspective. You might have one, you might have two, sometimes you might have more than that. And the vanishing point is basically the point at which parallel lines come together or converge. And the horizon is the line where the line of sight stops and on which the artist often places the vanishing point. So we'll see how that plays out in a moment. And then the vantage point is where we, the viewer, would be looking from. The height, how low, how high. One point perspective is when parallel lines in a picture come together at one point, the vanishing point on the horizon line. And 2-point perspective is when parallel lines in a picture come together at two different points on the horizon line. So here we go. On the left, we have actually the left and the middle picture both show us 1-point perspective. You can see there's a horizon. The horizon is that horizontal line, and there's the vanishing point. Everything recedes back to that vanishing point, and here we have it here as well. And then here we have 2-point perspective because there are two vanishing points. So this is a very simple sort of look at it. Let's look at it from an artistic perspective. How do artists actually use this? Okay, so this is a famous painting from the Renaissance by Raphael Sanzio, who's also known as Raphael. And this is his philosophy or school of Athens. And this is often held up as a masterpiece of linear perspective from the Renaissance. This is a 1-point perspective. And he's trying to create the illusion of great space. And basically, he's also making commentary about Greco-Roman philosophers and the artists of his time. He's actually painted this guy here. You can't see him, but that's Leonardo da Vinci. This is Michelangelo down here. I believe this is supposed to be Brancusi or Bramante. Doesn't matter right this moment. The most important thing is The horizon line is roughly about the center of the picture, and the vanishing point is between the two central figures. And then these lines are called orthogonals. And these are the lines that the artist uses to determine how large or small things appear on the picture plane. So, again, the larger parts recede back to the vanishing point. So he's using that to create the tile. He's using that to create where the architecture comes in. All of that helps him create a very realistic illusion of three-dimensional space. And then here we have a later painting from the 19th century from Gustave Caillebotte. And this is called Paris Street Rainy Day. And here it's two vanishing points here and here, and he's using it to make this building very realistically recede into the background. And then there's also atmospheric perspective, which is also known as aerial perspective. And with this, it has a texture gradient, which means the closer objects are perceived as having rougher or more detailed surfaces, and then a brightness gradient. The distant objects are less intense. So let's look at that. So this is Frederick Edwin Church's Andes of Ecuador, and you can see things that are closer have more detail. The leaves on the palm tree are more carefully rendered. You can kind of see the texture of the bark, and then things get dim back here, and that's also aerial perspective. Atmospheric. And then same thing here. This is actually a painting. It looks like a photograph, but it's a painting. And you can see everything's pretty far away in this, but still the things that are in the foreground are sharper and more defined. The things in the background are less distinct. And then finally, we're almost done, time and motion. We have actual motion. In kinetic art, that's art that moves. So for example, a mobile would be an example of kinetic art or actual motion. And then photography captures the idea of motion, or can show motion as it's happening. So here we have Alexander Calder. He was famous for doing his mobiles. This is a mobile that he did, East Building Mobile. This is at the University of Kentucky Art Museum, I believe. And you can see it actually moves. And then implied motion is stopped time, a style of art that stops time in order to imply motion. And time implied and motion implied. Some works try to imply that motion or time has actually occurred. So with photography, we can get very advanced ideas of that. Photography's come a long way. This is Liz Magic Lasers, The Thing, number 25, and she loves doing images of people with liquid being poured on them or splashing off of them. So there is that. And then, excuse me, this is John Lorenzo's Bernini. It's not a photograph, but it implies motion. It's a sculpture of Apollo and Daphne. It's in marble. And the story of Apollo and Daphne, Apollo was a god, Daphne was a mortal woman. He was pursuing her. She was not interested. Sorry, I've been talking a long time. So he's pursuing her, she's not interested. And Greeks and Romans had some crazy ideas about things. So she's running and running and running, and he's catching up because, well, he's a god. So she prays to the nature spirits around her, please help me, I can't escape this guy, I don't want to get raped, even if it's by a god. So they turned her into a tree, which I'm not sure that's a better solution, but that's what the Greeks and Romans said. So here we have that exact moment where Daphne is turning into a tree. And we have implied motion because, well, the thing covering up Apollo here is billowing out into the background. Also, his hair is kind of flying out behind him. And look, her hands are, turning into branches and sprouting leaves. And her lower body is turning into the trunk of a tree. So that is also implied motion. The artist has captured a moment in time. And there's a difference between implied motion and the illusion of motion. One implies that the motion has already occurred, and the other implies that the motion is happening right now. So we have early photographic experiments of multiple exposures of motion, the blurring of shapes and the repetition of linear patterns, blurring to create the contours of a figure, blurring outlines to create the illusion of motion, and then op art, which is short for optical art, and I'll show you what I mean in a moment. So this is an early photographic experiment from Thomas Eakins. Thomas Eakins loved to paint the human figure, and with photography, he got a much better idea of how to paint the human figure in motion. So here he's got multiple exposures of a man pole vaulting, and this gives us a definite feeling of movement there. And then later on, in the early 20th century, Umberto Boccioni painted Dynamism of a Soccer Player. Kind of gives you the same motion that we saw from the Thomas Eakins photograph. And then here, Kitchen Tantrums, we have a woman tossing potatoes into the air. They're blurred, so is the thing that she's tossing them out of. And then op art is optical art. As I said, it's based on creating optical sensations of movement through the repetition and manipulation of color, shape, and line. And then an after image is when we look at a color for a long period and look away, you might briefly see the opposite color due to the fatigue of the cornea in your eyes. So for example, this is Bridget Riley's Gala. And I don't know about you, but I feel seasick after looking at this for a while. So I'm going to stop. And that is the end of this chapter. And in the next chapter, we will get into the principles of design.